Good morning, and thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have all of you here this morning. The Bastion Institute does a series of strategic discussions, and it's all about how we strengthen our nation, which is a very important topic, especially today. This is the third event in the series, and the goal is clearly to talk about what's happening today and what the future looks like. So in the past, the Institute has assembled a field of experts from a variety of different places, elected officials, key personnel in the security, in our nation's security apparatus, and then key experts in fields. And today is no different. The Bastion Institute has gathered 3 immensely qualified panelists, and we're excited to have them here. And I'm sure it'll be interesting and very provocative today. So I'm excited to have all of you here. So let me just do a quick couple introductions. Of course, Iowa Senator Joni Ernst is here this morning. She's an incredible leader in the Army. I'm a retired veteran in the Army. We say she is the total package. She is a fantastic mother, and if I can do it on her daughter, she'll graduate from West Point this year and be commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. She is the first woman to be elected to Congress from the state of Iowa. She is also the first female combat veteran to serve in the United States Senate. 2 amazing feats. She sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and please join me in welcoming Senator Joni Ernst.
Thank you. Thank you.
And sitting next to me is Bridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative. The policy initiative is focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. We'll talk a lot about that idea today. He is an author. He wrote The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. And the Wall Street Journal has selected it as one of the top 10 books of 2021. Very, very interesting read, and I encourage you to read that. 2017 to 18, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that capacity, he served as the lead official in the development of the 2018 National Defense Security Strategy, which reoriented the Defense Department to focus on great power rivalry, such as China, and how it's emerged. What's interesting about that, I was in the ranks during that policy change, and the fact that I know the person that's responsible for changing the department's perspective is pretty significant. And so it's interesting to meet you. He's also on a number of other national security, he's done a number of other national security roles in government, and as a staff member for several blue ribbon government commissions. He's widely published in outlets in both the United States and abroad, and has testified a number of times before Congress. So please join me in welcoming Bridge. Thank you, sir. I was just talking to Richard Goldberg, reservist in the United States Army. What was very interesting about him is he is truly an expert in China and truly
Navy.
An expert in Iran.
Colonel Trotter, Navy.
Don't insult me like that.
So I think I should.
Just kidding.
Yeah, I think I have to rewind the whole conversation now. But an intelligence officer, but more importantly, he's also a senior advisor to the Foundation on Defending Democracy, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides key strategies for the government and others, and it's a very, very noble cause. 2019 and 2020, Richard served as the director of countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction for the White House National Security Council. Pretty impressive. And he served as the chief of staff for your former governor, Bruce Rauner, and deputy chief of staff and senior foreign policy advisor to former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois, both in the U.S. House and the Senate. Very interesting work that he's done for the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations. He's worked a wide range of issues related to U.S. foreign assistance, including foreign military financing, international security assistance, international peacekeeping, development, global health, and economic support funds. So quite clearly, he is immersed in working on a variety of issues for foreign policy. He's also one of the founding staff directors of the House U.S.-China Working Group and was among the first Americans ever to visit China's Human Space Launch Center. So that's interesting as well. And a leader in efforts to expand U.S. missile defense cooperation with Israel. So a very extensive portfolio. And we're really happy to have you here as well, Richard. So let's give him a warm welcome. So a big thank you to our panelists for being here this morning. Our format today is pretty straightforward. I'll ask a question to our panelists, and then the other panelists will have a chance to make additional comments or amplify points as they feel necessary. So let's begin. One of the biggest challenges, and I'm looking at Senator Ernst to answer this question or to start the discussion, but one of the biggest challenges that we face today is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Senator Ernst, the invasion is clearly what's been described as a land grab, violations of sovereignty of Ukraine, and it was clearly unprovoked. And the invasion has been a bloody invasion for civilians and non-combatants. And Tuesday night, the House passed a bill for $40 billion in security assistance package for Ukraine. Some have argued that the Biden administration have come to the game a little bit late. The question is this: what should be the United States role in the conflict going forward, both in the short term and the long term?
Thank you. And this is of great concern to us. And so much of the discussion in the United States Senate or in our Congress really centers around what's going on in Ukraine, because it does touch us. It touches my Iowans. It touches folks here in Illinois. As much as people want to believe that we operate in an isolationist type capacity, we're a strong nation, we don't need to engage with others, we are tied globally. It's affecting us economically, it's affecting our trade, it is affecting our national security. Ukraine matters. I do believe that the administration, in particular President Joe Biden, has been late to the game. We were engaging in a number of activities in Ukraine where we were strengthening their military forces through training and other activities. But I do believe we could have stepped up as soon as we saw the buildup of Russian troops, which happened months and months ago. We knew this was going on in the past year, yet the administration continued to see the buildup and did not work with the Ukrainians necessarily in a way that we should have. So short term, we can assist more with lethal aid. That's very important at this point, to make sure that they can push Russians out of those occupied areas, defend their sovereign country. But longer term as well, we need to make sure that we continue to work with Ukrainians and provide them the types of supports that will help them long term. Of course, the humanitarian aid is essential now, and that's a large part of the discussion that we have ongoing, because Ukraine does send so much of its product, its commodities, what's grown in Ukraine, to other areas around the globe. And we're facing some pretty serious global food insecurity, which we know then causes instability in nations that can then recruit for terrorists. And that does affect our national security. It really does matter.
Thank you. Bridge, how did the United States and the free world's failure to deter Russia's invasion of Ukraine embolden other great powers? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Colonel, and thanks for your kind introductions. It's an honor to be here with Senator Ernst. I mean, look, I think the main challenge the United States faces is from China. It's an overwhelmingly significant threat. I mean, it's 10 times the Russian economy. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an abomination. I think Senator Ernst was rightly saying it's important that we provide them with the lethal aid and other forms of aid. I think it's also critical that the Europeans step up to their responsibilities above all the Germans, both in terms of direct support to the Ukrainians as well as their own defense spending commitments. I think that's going to be vital, because the reality is that China is, as I said, 10 times the GDP of Russia. DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Will Haynes, said the other day, I think you were there, Senator, or at least at the hearing, said that there's an acute threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And candidly, for a number of years, I think there'd been dismissal of some of the warnings that Admiral Davidson gave last year. But that, hearing it from Haynes, who's a political appointee, that's a new level of alarm. So we really need to focus on that. And the fact is that we're behind the curve on China in terms of the defense. And I think the biggest assessment is that, yes, I think Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership will take from this situation that, you both know far better than I, military operations, especially offensive military operations, are very difficult, but they can be done. And actually, the other thing I think the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, Bill Burns, said over the weekend, he said Xi Jinping has not given up his goal on Taiwan at all.
Yeah.
And Taiwan is a piece of the broader puzzle of China's aspirations to dominate the world's largest market area, which is of direct importance to people here at home in the United States. Because if China controls well over 50% of global GDP, you can be sure that it will matter for us, that our freedoms and our prosperity will be greatly compromised. So my view is we've really got to focus on Asia, and while supporting the Europeans to step up and take this kind of primary responsibility for their own security, while remaining committed to NATO in a more focused way. But the biggest, to answer your question directly, Colonel, I think the biggest lesson or the biggest dynamic that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership will look to is not exactly how things go in Ukraine, but whether they can win in Taiwan. And if they think they can win, I think they're likely to push the envelope. And if they think they're likely to win over Taiwan, well, then they know they're going to get a lot of sanctions. And it's not sanctions that are stopping the Russians. It's the Ukrainians' defense. It's denial. It's military effort. And that's the critical lesson for us to learn. If the Chinese are willing to bite that bullet, I think they might be willing to go farther pretty quickly. And that's why it's critical that Taiwan really get off its, get out of its chair and get going, and Japan too, with urgency. Because I think our window, we're already in the window. So it's a very dangerous situation. It matters a lot to Americans. And we've never, the fact of the matter is for 150 years, we've been by far the largest economy in the world. That's not the case right now. I love America. I think we're the best in the world, but we got to deal with, it's just a final thought. My thing is, Tom Brady didn't win X number of Super Bowls by every year thinking, hey, I'm the best. I don't have to work hard. He's like, I'm going to be the best again next year and get to the Super Bowl because I'm going to train hard and I'm going to look at my opponents and be at the very tippy edge of my performance. And I think that's how we need to look at China.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Any other comments on Bridget's point?
No. Well, I want to echo that absolutely. I think that with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and working with Ukraine, we absolutely should be doing what we can to help the Ukrainians push back on Russia. But China is the pacing threat. Mm-hmm. And that's what we always have to keep in mind out there. One thing that I do want to stress is that while we want to focus on the Indo-PACOM area, that's important that we do that. Militarily, we can focus on that region, but we have to remember that the Chinese are everywhere right now. They are building ports all around the globe. They're expanding their reach into other areas like Africa and South America. So while we focus on the Indo-PACOM, it's not just a region anymore. We should focus on the Chinese in total and where they are and how they are influencing.
Yes, Richard.
Yeah, I would just say 2 points. A third being Bridget's point on Europe having complicity in what is going on right now is very sound, and we should not just put this on U.S. policy, but also on our allies. And that's not just vis-a-vis Russia, that's also vis-a-vis China as well coming forward. If our allies are not understanding the threats, if they don't understand that we are in this together against despots, against authoritarian regimes, if they cozy up, if they allow themselves to become economically or energy dependent on these regimes, we're going to be in very bad spots when something actually happens. And we've seen that play out because of Germany and others. But 2 key points that I'd sort of take away is, one, everything is connected in this world, as Senator, you were saying, and it comes home to you. You are paying higher gas prices today. Why is that all happening? Well, obviously it starts with domestic energy policy, but then it bleeds into a lot of decisions that you think aren't connected in the world. They're operating in silos. Somebody poll tested, it's not politically popular to stay in Afghanistan anymore. It's costing too much money. We have 2,500 troops. We've gotten ourselves down to a very residual force that's absolutely defensible that we could hang on to at low cost with very low cost both to our forces and to our purse. But we say, let's get out. And the president decides he wants to just get out, does it in a disastrous way. Clearly no care for how that looks to the world's despots when Kabul collapses in a matter of days with the Taliban marching. What does Russia take away from that? What does China take away from that? What does Iran take away from that moment? And then as we start understanding intelligence that Putin is preparing for a possible invasion of Ukraine with weeks to plan for it, what is the reaction? There's no political will to stand up. There's no deterrence. There's no attempt either through military deterrence, positioning our forces, or through economic sanctions to actually try to force Putin into a different direction. And what happens? We're forced onto defense. Meanwhile, we have an Iran policy at the same time that's been going on, right? You don't think it's connected, but guess who thinks it's all connected at a time when oil prices go up? The Saudis and the Emiratis. When we're negotiating with the Iranians to go back into a nuclear deal, lift all sanctions, take the IRGC, who conducts attacks against the Saudis and the Emiratis every day, take them off our terror list. And then suddenly oil prices skyrocket because Russia's invaded and we're considering sanctions on Russian energy. So who do we call? Our allies, who we've always had for 75 plus year relationship of security for oil. And we say, King, can you swing oil production? Are you kidding me? I mean, what do you think he's going to say at that moment, right? So everything is connected. And my last point would be, we had a national security strategy that was outstanding, thanks to great people like Bridge. And it said China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are your top 4 threats, right? Which means we need to have a military and a political apparatus that is capable of fighting all of those threats at any given moment. The idea that we have to choose between readiness and modernization, we have to choose between this threat or that threat, is not the way a superpower needs to operate. We need to be ready for all our threats, and our budget needs to reflect that as well.
So a follow-on question for you, Richard. You briefly mentioned it, and when you were talking about the impact on the nation and the impact on Americans in general, could you go into a little bit more detail of what you think the impact will be on our citizens?
In general, for Russia, or
for what this invasion means?
Listen, if we are not able to bring stability to oil markets, if we are not able to decisively push back and force Putin into a position where he pulls back his forces and brings this conflict to a close, then we continue to have uncertainty in the markets continuously. We also do not clearly have an articulated sanctions policy that goes ahead and actually directs as much maximum pressure at Vladimir Putin as possible while avoiding as much pressure on our own population as possible. What do I mean by that? Because the administration was clearly in a sort of mode where I think that they had a failed IC assessment that said Kyiv was going to fall very quickly to Vladimir Putin. And the president just did not want to get involved. They're not a NATO country. It's too late. It would cost too much. We'll be drawn into World War III. I'm not fighting. It's going to be over in 3 days, right? Sort of the opposite problem they had with Kabul, by the way. They were all of a sudden playing catch up. And by the time the missiles started firing and we were in this military conflict watching Putin invading Ukraine, there were no sanctions packages ready. The Germans were objecting to any harsh sanctions against the main sources of Putin's revenue. So we've been going piecemeal, trying to catch up to wherever the Europeans can get consensus slowly but surely. And every time we roll out more sanctions, jitters the oil market that much more. So we keep sort of pulsing the system and not actually doing maximum pressure all at once so that we can bring this to a close quickly. What would you do? You would say, okay, we're going to impose secondary U.S. sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia, on Sberbank, on Gazprom Bank, on the energy sector of Russia, on their entire financial sector. And for those that are energy importers of Russian energy, you can keep importing that energy. We'd like you to draw that down over time. but the money has to stay in escrow. The money can't go back to Moscow. And then it's on Putin. Does he want to shut down production? Does he want to just destroy his economy? If he's suicidal, he can do that. But that would put all the pressure on Putin, lift the pressure back on us, and stop this piecemeal environment where you're trying to convince German citizens to pay extraordinary prices for energy, watching American citizens watch the price of the pump go up, where China's free to continue to import energy, India's free to continue to import energy. I think people at home say that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
And if I could just tag on, because I think this is an incredible discussion about why does it matter to Americans. It does matter, and for all of these reasons, the calls that I get at my office in Washington, D.C., the Iowans that I visit with every day when I'm out doing my county tours, they are concerned about the price at the pump. And we were just talking about what is the number one issue that Iowans are talking about. It's inflation. I'll be honest, it's inflation. But so much of that is because of transportation costs and the cost of fuel. A lot has stemmed out of the Russian invasion, but we also have others that are experiencing volatility in their retirement accounts. The stock market has dropped 3,000 points since the invasion. We have seen groceries, the global food costs have gone up 54% since this invasion. And the longer this goes on, it just continues to exacerbate the issue for every American family out there. And it matters. And we need people to understand that there is a ripple effect. Anytime you have a regime like Vladimir Putin's that goes into a sovereign country, especially one as important when it comes to global food security as Ukraine, it impacts all of us. So it matters. It matters pocketbook issues, but it also matters because you have the attempted expansion of an autocratic regime that is taking on a democratic nation. And when you see those types of regimes expand their presence around the globe, you're automatically going to see democracy shrink. That matters as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, excellent. Great answers, and thank you for helping explain, these impacts on our nation. We've talked a little bit about China. Let's go ahead and dive in to China. You don't have to be a foreign policy expert to realize that China is a national security threat to the United States, clearly. And in the eyes of the Chinese, their ascension to global supremacy by 2050 will be predicated on two things: the diminishment of American power in general and our influence. So, Bridge, my first question, and I recently read your article, U.S. presses Taiwan to buy weapons more suited to win against China. I thought it was fascinating. And in that, you liken deterrence as a porcupine for Taiwan. I was wondering if you could expound upon that idea of what it means to make Taiwan capable of defending itself. So my question is how does the United States, let me start again. How will the Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan or maybe other disputed territories? When do you think that could happen? And when do we have to be prepared by so that we can deter it?
Sure. Well, thanks, Dave. And I think you've delved into some of my writing, so you've gone to a dark place, I guess. But, I talk a lot about Taiwan, but I think it's important. It's not because I have a special affinity for Taiwan. I like Taiwan. I've been there a couple of times. It's a wonderful country. It has a lot to admire it. But I don't think we should be committing American forces to fight and die just because we like a country, right? That's not the job we were talking about before, the U.S. Armed Forces. I think that the reason that Taiwan is so important to us, I think it helps that it's a democracy, that we can see that we have a lot of like-minded values. But what's really important is that it's a critical part of what China's goal is. And you mentioned it, by mid-century. China has these kind of, very kind of formulaic sort of set, plans. They have 5-year plans, kind of a communist thing that is sort of a holdover. But they're quite explicit that they want to dominate the world. And I don't think, hopefully it could be wrong. It could be worse. I don't think they're thinking Genghis Khan or Hitler kind of thing. But what they are thinking, and we see them doing it right now, is developing a power position in the world in order to dominate everybody else. And, I think we in America have become very accustomed over the last, 75 years to a world in which the dollar is the reserve currency. We're the largest market. We're the preferred destination for capital. You have to follow our sanctions. You have to follow our regulations if you want to compete in that market. That's a pretty great world for us. Look, there's some downsides to it, but it's a pretty great situation. It's so great that the Chinese want it, and Xi Jinping wants that. And so their economic policies are geared towards this. So their current policies of like dual circulation are specifically designed to decrease our leverage over them and increase their leverage over us. But their military policies are too, because their political goal, I believe, is that they want to achieve a dominant position in Asia. And we got to understand that Europe is not the center of the world anymore. I love Europe. I love going there. It's a wonderful place. But, it's going to be 10% of global GDP in 20 years. Asia is going to be huge market areas where most of the world's population is, enormous economic dynamism. So if they control that, Winston Churchill said, if you get things right in the decisive theater, you can put everything afterwards right again. And we got to get something right in the decisive theater, and that's where China is. And again, China is a superpower that is as large an economy as we are, and it's still growing. They're having trouble right now due to COVID, and Xi Jinping has made some bad decisions on an economic basis. But I don't count them out. So I think that would be an imprudent bet. Why is this going to matter to America? Well, look at what the Chinese are doing to Australia. This is a good test case, and I think it's actually relevant for states that export heavily to China. Australia is a natural resource exporter, very focused on China. Minerals, these kinds of things, agriculture. The Australians a couple of years ago, they had the audacity to demand an independent investigation of the origins of COVID-19. Whoa, crazy, right? Crazy. Well, the Chinese responded by slapping not only a huge number of sanctions on the poor Australians, but 14 demands that include changes to Australia's free speech legislation, political rules, donation rules on foreign donations, etc. So basically, like compromising Australia's own freedom, not to mention zip program. Now, the Australians, to their great credit, are standing up, and we should support them. But they're standing up because they know we're in their corner. That's the only reason if we get to that point where the Chinese can do that to us, who are we going to look to? We're the only ones that are strong enough. That's just the reality. So if that's the case, we can't let China dominate Asia, right? And Taiwan is critical to that because Taiwan is a signal to everybody in Asia, because the reality is that the countries in Asia, and again, this is about American interests, not about theirs primarily. But if you're in Japan or Philippines or Vietnam or India, you're going to wonder whether it's safe to stand up to China, because you don't want to live under China's boot or its thumb. But if your alternative is really getting hurt and getting excluded from all the goodies that China can offer, you may make a deal. There's an expression in Southeast Asia that you bend before the wind blows, that you accommodate, you avoid the confrontation. So that's a very real problem. And Taiwan is also very militarily important. It's important to the defense of Japan, which is critical. The problem is, as DNI Haynes said, to answer your question, Colonel, the Chinese have been laser focused on this. They've been using all kinds of catch up. They've been stealing our technology. Now they can develop a lot of their own technology. They're 100 miles from the island. We've been doing a lot of other things. We haven't been this focused. We tried in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. The administration appears to want to continue trying. But my basic question to the administration is, if you're saying there's an acute threat of a superpower war that we're on a track to lose, are you acting like that's about what's to happen? Because the best way to deter China is for them to assess that they'll fail, right? And that's about America, but that's also about turning Taiwan into a porcupine, learning from what the Ukrainians are doing and saying, if you try to fight this country off, it's like a blowfish or whatever, porcupine again. It's going to be a lot worse for you. And we can do that. We can do that at a reasonable cost, because this is not an existential issue for us, but it's a really important issue for us. And this is what worries me, is that the big lesson to me, one of the big lessons of Ukraine is, there's all this spiking the football about how, we're coordinating with the Europeans, but it took a massive war. It took the biggest war in Europe since World War II to precipitate that. If we allow that to happen vis-a-vis Taiwan, it might be too late. So we need to have that sense of urgency before the fight, so we avoid it, both because we don't want Americans to die, and also because it might be too late, we might fail. And we should not think that just because the Ukrainians are stepping up to the Russians that the Taiwanese would be able to succeed, because China's a lot bigger, Taiwan's a lot harder to resupply, and that's it's hard to get across that ocean. But if you got enough forces, if you've got enough people's armed police and all their security organs, they can lock that country down. And so we do not want to get to that point. So that's why I try to bring this sense of urgency, this focus and prioritization, because if we get to the point where we've gotten in Ukraine, it may well be too late.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. We've looked at Taiwan from a military perspective, and the logistics are just horrific. It would be very hard to be a part of something like that. Senator, let's shift to trade policies. I know Iowa exported $20 billion in agricultural products last year. It's good for Iowa farmers. It's good for the state economy. It's certainly good for the U.S. economy. How do we balance strategically trade and some of the things that Bridge talked about, just now?
Oh, absolutely. And we do export a lot of our ag goods to China. It is not our largest trade partner in Iowa, but it is significant. It's in the top 5. Mm-hmm. And so with that, we understand that it's good to have that relationship, but you have to understand those pitfalls. Just as Bridge spelled out, there's a lot of strings that come attached to China. Mm-hmm. But what we do know is that China needs us, and they need other nations to feed their population. And that's what we should use as leverage, and just not take that relationship for granted, but we can use it as leverage. And the Chinese need to understand, and we should have enforceable regulations put in place as well. But if they are going to trade with us, they can't steal our intellectual property. They shouldn't be violating human rights. So there are some things that we as the United States need to follow up on as well. We saw an attempt to do this in the Trump administration. There were tariffs that went onto Chinese goods. Of course, then the Chinese pushed back on us a little bit. But I had an Iowa farmer that came to one of my town halls, and he said, the tariffs, I get it. I don't like tariffs, but I understand, because China has been messing around, with Iowa farmers for a very long time. They would negotiate corn contracts, and as the corn is moving across the Pacific Ocean to China, then the Chinese would cancel those contracts and renegotiate a lower price. So we have seen so much funny business going on in the trade space. We just need the leadership there to really enforce those trade obligations with China. But at the same time, while this trade is good, they need us. We also need to find other outlets for our goods, American goods, with friends and allies as well. Very, very important. So we need to explore those opportunities greater. We need to put more time and energy behind it. Our USDA needs to do that. Our trade rep needs to do that. And we need to find ways in Taiwan as well. I'm going to divert a little bit there because the trade space is good, but I do want to go back to Taiwan as well. We're good trade partners with Taiwan. We need to find other countries in that region that we can be good trade partners with as well, because good trade partners do make then good allies and friends. And many of them would rather, in that Indo-Pacific region, would rather do trade with the United States than with China. But China is the one stepping into that space and saying, hey, we will provide trade. You don't need to look to the United States. You don't need to look to Australia. Look to us. Mm-hmm. We'll be that trade partner. So we would like to cut a little of that Chinese trade off. But then flip side, we need to resource more domestically. We allow China to get away with using slave labor, child labor, other things that we would find immoral here in the United States. So we need to develop our own American resources and industry rather than being so reliant. I know and understand maybe the cost of goods would go up a little bit by doing that, but we're investing in American businesses and in American jobs rather than continuing to lean heavily on China.
Could I just add something to what Senator Ernst was saying, if I might, just on the trade front? I think one of the things is that I think if we get our military perimeter right and strong enough, we can actually have a pretty robust commercial relationship with China. Because I think one of the things that China is finding, and we've found over the years, is that sanctions only go so far. They're of limited efficacy in generally getting a country to really give up something it doesn't want to. In our experience in Iraq, I mean, you served there, and some served there. I mean, that was an example where our sanctions weren't enough at the end of the day. The good news of that for us is that if a country's got resolve, like Australia, and I think like America, if they want to cut something off, and it's over something that's, really important to us, like invading Japan or Taiwan or something, it's not going to work. Now I think that's consistent with bringing home a lot of our, which I fully support, trying to, sort of revitalize our industrial base and bring home parts that they stole and hold them to account, absolutely. But I don't think that means that we need to fully cut off the trade. Actually, the irony is the weaker our military, often the people who are pushing for, closer trade relations with China will often say, don't strengthen the military. But actually, if you want to be able to preserve an economic relationship at all with China, we've got to have a military defense, because otherwise we're going to look to the economic sanctions as our only alternative. And then, by the way, it's not going to work. But then you're going to have, then your trade's going to be really exposed, where if the Chinese see that an invasion of Taiwan, because at the end of the day, I don't think they're going to be able to hoodwink or coerce Taiwan into giving up, let alone Japan or South Korea. It's not going to work. It's usually going to backfire. So that the good news is, but the bad news is that means they're going to look at the military instrument. So if we convince them that they can't have the military instrument's not going to work, and they know that that they can't just, force us to give up on Taiwan because they cut off, XYZ trade relationship, then I think we're going to be able to negotiate a modus vivendi with the Chinese. We might not, I detest communism, but it's not our business at the end of the day to change the Chinese government. That's the Chinese people. I hope for their sake they're able to get a more free government. But we could live in that world. But I think that's the way to think about this, where actually the military strengthening will allow us actually to have more scope for that commercial relationship and in a more stable, but that's not where we are right now, unfortunately.
No, and that's interesting. I think I'm just going to jump in before I turn to you, because I think this is important for you as well, Rich, is that you're saying through the discussions here that it does come back to what I always turn to is the old Ronald Reagan and many other adage of strength through peace, or peace through strength. And that means really exhibiting that leadership and strength and having that military might so that we don't have pressures coming from some of these other near peer adversaries, including Iran. And I think Iran, when they look to us in their negotiations, they see very weak leadership, and they see the opportunity to take advantage of where we are as the United States.
Well, absolutely. And 2 points. One is on the military front, I couldn't agree with both of you more. And it also takes political will, though, right? So you can have the best military in the world. You could be ready for a war, but you need political will to actually do the things you need to do to deter your enemies, to make sure they perceive that you are willing to use that military if push comes to shove. Because if they don't have that perception, we've seen what happens in Ukraine. Right now, we have a budget on the table from the president that is abhorrent for the U.S. Navy going forward if we are actually serious about confronting the China threat over the next 5 to 10 years. Bridge can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're looking at overmatch from the Chinese in the Pacific around 2027, and the budget we have today would do nothing to correct that. We would be looking at the potential to lose a war with China in the Pacific. We cannot allow that to happen. So obviously we have to have a budget that reflects the threat and invests heavily now so that we are prepared to meet that threat when it comes, so that we can actually do all these things, that we can actually deter, that we can arm, that we can project strength, not just on behalf of the United States, but on behalf of our allies. But I think there's also a sanctions piece in this as well, because if you have political leadership that is unwilling to use force, if China decides that their perception of a president in the White House is they will not do anything if we invade Taiwan. And, we hope we've armed Taiwan well enough. We hope Taiwan's bought the right things, and, go with the grace of God as the way Zelensky's gone in Ukraine. we do have to have some sort of a backstop, additional deterrence, perhaps from the Congress, to have in the back of Xi's mind, because he is susceptible to financial sanctions. The Chinese economy is so interdependent with ours financially still that the threat of financial sanctions on the People's Bank, on some of their major banks, et cetera, you've seen them change behavior with other sanctions regimes. We don't even have secondary sanctions on Russia at the moment. You see the Chinese still hedging because they're predicting that potentially secondary sanctions are coming. And they're in a state of financial weakness already, in their COVID state, in some of the economic poor decisions that Bridge is alluding to. They can't afford to be susceptible to U.S. financial sanctions today. I was once in a meeting with a very high-level Chinese leader. This is probably 10, 15 years ago. And he said an old Chinese proverb is, when you owe $1 million to the bank owns you. When you owe $1 billion to the bank, you own the bank. Right? And so they do have that a little bit in the back of their mind. And so we do need to prepare both on the military front and on the economic deterrence front. My last point will be, anybody who is alive right now and is living through COVID and post-COVID and the supply chain is understanding some basic needs that we need to reassess in our economy and in our trade relationship. If there are critical areas to our national security, to our economic security, where we are wholly dependent on China, and in a crisis, in a pandemic, in a war, they can strangle us in key areas, that is something we have to address immediately.
Well, you mentioned defense spending. You mentioned the military. Let's talk about it right now. It's very clear that those threats are real. The budget that currently is from the Department of Defense that is being considered, the Air Force will lose, I think, 150 planes. The Navy will lose 24 or decommission 24 ships. And the Army will be at the lowest level it's been since World War II. So an incredible lack of spending, in that regard. So the question is, are we actually on the right, moving in the right direction with a budget such as that to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish? And are those strategies? What are the strategies to change that? And Senator, why don't I just start with you?
This is a very frustrating year on top of many other frustrating years. And with the budget that has been proposed by the president and the level of inflation that exists here in the United States, the buying power of the military has decreased significantly, which leaves us at a budget that's flat, where we can't sustain some of these legacy programs. So there are areas where we need to divest. That's most certainly true. And I would agree with some of the assessments that there are different programs that we need to exit out of. The problem then becomes, though, that we need to modernize our forces. And this budget leaves very little room to modernize our forces. You're right, the Army is going to drop down to its lowest level pre-World War II. We will lose about 12,000 troops through attrition and retirements that will not be replaced. This is a signal to our adversaries that this administration does not see the value in our military and our Department of Defense. Again, peace through strength. I think we have to have a very strong military in order to deter some of these other pacing threats like China, like Russia, like Iran. So we really have to be serious about this. And I do hope that Congress can correct what we are doing and start investing in the areas we need to invest in. This administration, and I get very worked up about this because I served, through the National Guard and the reserves for 23 years. I'm investing as a United States Senator now and as a mother in the future of our military. And I want to make sure that we are training and resourcing the men and women that choose to defend our nation. I want to make sure we're doing the right thing by them. But what we have seen is a doctrine of appeasement with this with this administration. And through that doctrine of appeasement, they have made us very weak on a world stage when it comes to our military. And instead of investing in modernizing our capabilities and protections for those men and women in uniform, what we have seen, one of their big initiatives in the United States military is to move all of our non-tactical vehicles to an all-electric vehicle force. That is one of their top priorities, is making sure the pickup trucks that we're buying in the military are electric vehicles. That is not encouraging to me as a senator, nor as a mother of a soon-to-be second lieutenant in our United States Army. We really need to make sure that we have a strong military and not one that's just climate friendly. So there's where I am on the budget. We can do better. Certainly, I believe in protecting our taxpayer dollars. I think that that is really important. We need to invest wisely. But as an administration, I wish that our president were out there focusing on the lethality of our military rather than the emissions of those non-tactical vehicles.
Thank you, Senator. And doctrine of appeasement, very interesting concept, and I appreciate you laying that out for us. Bridge, if you were king for a day, where would you invest that money?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I agree with what the senator is saying. I mean, I think we want to balance, being strong and the fact that, you can pay now or you can pay more later at some level, but also be good stewards of the tax members of Congress being good stewards. I mean, I think as a conservative, you always want to be, not profligate, right? So the way I kind of look at it is, what are the real missions of the armed forces that we absolutely need as a country to have done? And I think those are to be able to ensure that we can defeat a Chinese invasion of an ally in Asia, because that's the big kahuna, that's the decisive theater. If we can get that right, much better. If we don't get it right, we'll pay a lot more. The second thing is we need a nuclear deterrent to protect this country from any type of coercion by either the Russians or the Chinese, and the Chinese are building up. And then third, I think we all don't want to have a repeat of 9/11, so we want to have a kind of more efficient way of doing counterterrorism. And then I would say an additional smaller mission where we support NATO in a more focused way. Whatever that costs, to me, that's what we should do. But I think the first order of business is to make as ruthlessly efficient use in the focus on lethality as possible of the enormous resources that are already given by the American. I mean, I was struck by, we as a nation, we all spend over 3% of our income every year on the national security enterprise, the Defense Department. So we should get a lot of value out of that. I think realistically, we're going to have to increase defense spending just to get ahead of some of the problems of inflation that Senator mentioned. Our defense industrial base is in pretty sorry shape, and that's a real problem. I think the Navy Admiral said the other day that the Navy currently would not be able to repair ships in wartime, which was pretty surreal. I mean, presumably ships are going to get hit in wartime, right? So, like, if you can't repair them, that means you get a sprained ankle, you're out for the rest of the season. I mean, that's kind of ludicrous. So that's my perspective. But what I would do, to your question, Colonel, is really focus, and this is what we try to do in the National Defense Strategy in 2018. I'm of the keep it simple, stupid school. Like, focus on, if you're not working on China or one of these other things that are top priorities, you better be thinking about something else. And I mean, that's good. That's always encouraging to me that people like you felt it out, in the operating force, and lethality and resilience, and a focus on what I call a strategy of denial, which the administration has now stated that they, I think, endorse. I mean, Deputy Secretary Hicks said it to our friend Roger Zakheim the other day. So I was like, okay, that means, and that's basically, you can stop an invasion. That's not you let them come in and you throw some rocks at them afterwards to try to convince them to do something else. That's it. So I would say, real focus on, and I think they are trying to buy the munitions, the platforms. Like you, I support a lot of the divest to invest, because you need to get rid of stuff that's not relevant. But my question is, and I haven't seen any credible statement from the administration on this, and I'm just mystified, is divest to invest is great. Focusing on artificial intelligence and supercomputing in 2035. Okay, great. But, your own director of national intelligence says there's an acute threat of invasion before 2027. And by the way, the Chinese conceded you're modernizing for 2035. So they might say like, well, I'm not going to wait around when I have an advantage. So what's their plan for getting us through this next 5 to 6 years? I haven't seen anything. I just like haven't seen an answer. And if we've got to tape stuff together and make the best of it, so be it. And that's the kind of thing where I think we're probably going to have to spend more. But I mean, to me, again, it's the goal that we want to have, which is we are past the point where we can take a knee and for modernizing. 10 years ago, you could make that case, but now we're in the window. And, they're sort of, frankly, they're talking a good game from the Pentagon, but then again, you never know how much weight they carry internally. I mean, the fact that their budget came in below inflation, it's pretty, the president's out there saying that, we're in a battle between democracy and authoritarianism and we've got superpower rivals. And then he submits a defense budget that's below inflation. Like, I don't think that rhetoric is actually appropriate. I'm more focused, but like, what gives? That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm like just befuddled.
Well, Richard, same question to you. If you were king for the day, what would you invest in?
I think Bridge laid out priorities perfectly. I think the inflation piece is the most basic, right? That's the one where everybody can sort of come around the table and understand. You can have fights over this platform, that platform. There's politics to get into platforms sometimes. I think we probably all agree on certain ones that we need to keep, some that the administration is trying to dump, especially in our strategic deterrence. But ultimately, if you're planning on a 3% inflation, at 8% inflation, how is that something you can do for your national defense? That's crazy, right? So at the very least, you got to plus up this budget to account for inflation, at the very, very least. But I do think we have to think about these long-term threats. I think it's a false choice that the services continue to present to us. I think they do this under duress, that it's either readiness or modernization. It's both. You have to be able to have a budget for both. You have to press on deadlines for both. And on our strategic deterrent, we are seeing right now in the Russia context why that is important. I know a lot of people think this is what your parents and grandparents went through, that this is old Cold War ideas. And I understand that people who used to chain themselves to fences are now in charge of policy in the Defense Department. Yeah. But I'm sorry, we need a strong nuclear deterrent. There's a reason for it. We are entering a new Cold War. We're in it. And if we do not have a strong nuclear deterrent, then those that do will push us throughout the world. And this is not just on the highest yield and the biggest bombs we have, which we need to maintain, like B-83, which the president wants to cancel, but it's also on having low yield options, which we really don't have. And we're seeing this play out right now. People are saying, well, what happens if the Russians use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? What are we going to do about it? We don't have good answers. And that's why you don't hear anybody saying this is what we should do in response. And so when we are looking at new platforms, new ideas, R&D on low yield options, we need to continue those. Submarine launched cruise missile nuclear. We need to continue that.
Very interesting. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our session, and I want to give each of the panelists a chance to provide some closing comment. So let's start with you, Bridge, and then Richard and Senator Ernst.
Great. Well, no, thank you, Dave, and thanks to Senator and Rich to be on this panel. I guess I just close, briefly on a central theme, which is the kind of the relevance to Americans of what we're talking about. I mean, in my work, in my book and stuff, I really try to, address the, what's in it for us issue, which I think is a legitimate question. But I think and I personally, I sympathize with a lot of the skepticism about, overseas interventions and so forth. And, after all this, we were talking about this that's been going on in the last couple of decades. But, just because we've made mistakes in the past and just because there have been abuses and so forth and failures, it doesn't mean that the total reverse is true, that we can sort of stick our heads in the sand. And I think the reality is that, we're an immensely powerful country. We've got a lot of problems at home, as we all know. But I wouldn't really trade places with anybody. But on the other hand, the future of the world and the future of our lives, if we're all going to essentially be working for the Asian economy directly or indirectly, it's going to be the world's largest market. So whatever you do, you're going to be highly exposed to it, whether directly selling that market or serving that market, or indirectly, and through family or something like that. And I think we have to be very attuned to that. We have to be alive to that. And the key thing, I think, the lesson of our history is we have the option, we have the luxury of saying we're going to sit behind our oceans. But the lesson is that we've basically been pulled out of that. So, the lesson of the last, I think, generation to me is don't go too far. But the lesson of a lot of our history before that was don't wait too long because, World War II, it's World War I, like these things are something, if we could have avoided them at a lower cost, everybody would be better. A lot of people would still be alive, and that's the sort of thing. And now we're back in a world of great power rivalry with a country that, if you want to learn a lesson of Ukraine, if an authoritarian government spends a lot of money on its military and says that it wants to, attack a neighbor, basically, maybe you should take them at face value. And the best way, the safest way to get through this is to present them with the reality that they're not going to succeed. And that is difficult, but it is doable. But I think if we can get that, then we can hope for peace. My hope is that we can have peace. We can avoid a big war, God forbid. But just because you don't want a war doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared for it. You know this better than anybody. The whole point is by demonstrating to them that we're ready, that we're committed, as Rich was saying, we got to demonstrate resolve, but also capability. Then we'll be in a much better world, and that's the world I want to live in.
Richard.
I continue to come back to, I think, my opening statement, which is everything is connected. And sometimes we see these issues in silos. Sometimes we have political debates because it's easy to separate them. But everything ultimately is connected in a world, especially through the prism of great power competition. China is everywhere. Russia is moving everywhere. And when you look at Afghanistan, where you have a U.S. military presence, intelligence presence right over the border from China, and you give that up, that has consequences. The way you give that up, the way that authoritarian regimes see you withdraw, see you allow your allies to be overrun in a matter of days, has consequences. In Iran, if we allow Iran to go back into a nuclear deal where they get flooded with $100 billion to fund terrorism, to fund missiles, to fund their nuclear program against our allies and against the United States, to build longer and longer missiles, right, including ICBMs that they want to build, that they are working on, to reach the United States homeland. That has consequences for us. And of course, as we saw, when you abandon your traditional allies and there is an actual crisis and the United States needs help, we are not just alone in this world. We need our friends and allies. We need to treat our allies like allies and our enemies like what they are, our enemies. And when we confuse those issues, when we separate them out, even in the pursuit of good deeds, that we have limited resources, we need to get out of the Middle East, we need to just look at China. It's all connected now. China wants in on Iran. China has a 25-year memorandum of understanding with the Iranians the minute we lift sanctions. They want port access in the Gulf. They want the critical infrastructure access. And so no matter where you look now, in our own backyard in South America, in the Middle East, in Africa, or in Asia, we are surrounded by the great power competition, and we need to work with our allies, empower our allies, and ensure we don't make decisions that empower our enemies.
Senator.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colonel Trotter and Bridge and Rich. Thank you for such a great discussion this morning. I am honored and humbled to be with such great thought leaders. So thank you for taking the time to be here today as well. And the Bastion Institute, of course, thanks to them for hosting today's forum. But I do believe that America really is that great shining light. And the rest of the world does look to the United States to exhibit leadership in difficult times, whether it is during the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, whether it is in that great power competition around the globe with folks like China and Iran. I think it's extremely important that we show leadership. A doctrine of appeasement is absolutely unacceptable, especially from the United States of America. We have to be able to provide the leadership around the world. I believe in America first, I do, but it's not America alone. We have to enable those partners and allies to defend themselves, and we can provide that leadership. It's exactly as we see in Ukraine, where we are enabling the Ukrainians to fight their own kinetic fight against Russia. We should have done more much sooner, and we can do that with Taiwan. We can do that with other friends. It's a small investment on America's part if we are engaging globally. It costs us less as a nation when we are being proactive rather than reactive, and we shed less blood as Americans if we engage early. So again, America is that light out there. We are the country that other countries run to when they need assistance. They're not running to Russia They're not running to China. They are not running to Iran. They run to the United States. And it's time that we stand up, we take on that mantle of leadership, and we exhibit authority where we need to show authority. No more doctrine of appeasement. Again, I thank you so much for being here today and for allowing me to join in this great discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ma'am. And thanks to all of our panelists. It's been extremely enlightening and provocative. And on behalf of the team out here, we're very thankful for all the things that you do. And to you in the audience, thank you for coming today. We really appreciate that. Thank you to the Bastion Institute for setting up this series of extremely important discussions. And lastly, just God bless our country. God bless our leaders, and God bless our service members that are in foreign countries and serving our country in a variety of different ways. And again, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.